Hello everyone, welcome back to Miss Afro-Korean Story. Have you ever acted weak just so you could truly know the heart of someone? To see how they would treat you the moment you no longer had anything to offer them? What reaction did you get? Was it positive or negative? I'll be waiting in the comment section to hear your thoughts. Meanwhile, if you're newly joining our family, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss my emotional Afro-Korean stories. Also, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments as we continue the story. Now, let's begin.
6 weeks earlier, Kelvin Jun had everything. He was 34 years old, the CEO of Jun Holdings, a conglomerate that touched real estate, technology, and finance across 5 countries. He was sharp, decisive, the kind of man who walked into a boardroom and immediately owned it without saying a single word. Women wanted him. Men wanted to be him. And Grace Tan, his fiancée of 8 months, was the envy of every socialite in Seoul. They looked perfect together. She was elegant, polished, the kind of beautiful that photographed well. She knew how to hold a wine glass, how to greet dignitaries, how to sit beside Kelvin at charity galas, and make the whole world believe she was devoted to him. And for a while, even Kelvin believed it. But there was always something. A flicker of irritation when he stayed late at the office. A subtle coldness when his attention shifted from her. Small things. Things he told himself he was imagining. Then his father called. Chairman Jun was a man of few words and enormous weight. When he spoke, people listened not out of fear, but because his words had a way of landing exactly where they needed to land. He had built the Jun empire from nothing, and he had watched enough men lose everything to the wrong woman to know the signs. "Kelvin," he said, his voice steady over the phone. "Before you marry her, test her." Kelvin was quiet. "Not her loyalty in good times," his father continued. "Anyone can stay when life is comfortable. Test her when everything is gone. When there is nothing left to gain. That is where the truth lives." Kelvin didn't answer immediately. He stood at his office window looking out at the Seoul skyline, the city gleaming below him like scattered diamonds. He thought about Grace. About the way she smiled when photographers were present versus the way she barely smiled when they were alone. He thought about the questions he had been pushing down for months. He made his decision that night. Sandru was the only person Kelvin trusted completely. They had been friends since university, long before the empire, long before the wealth, back when Kelvin was just a stubborn kid with big ambitions and Sandru was the quiet one who somehow always knew the right thing to do. Now Sandru was his personal lawyer, his closest confidant, and the only man alive who knew what Kelvin was about to do. "You understand this will be painful," Sandru said. They were seated in Kelvin's private office, the blinds drawn, the door locked. "You will have to commit completely. If you flinch, the whole thing falls apart." "I won't flinch." "Kelvin." Sandru leaned forward. "I'm not talking about the physical discomfort. I'm talking about watching someone you love show you who they really are. That kind of pain doesn't heal quickly." Kelvin looked at him. "That's exactly why I need to know before the wedding. Not after." Sandru exhaled slowly. Then he nodded. "All right. I'll arrange everything." 2 weeks later, news broke across every major media outlet in South Korea. Kelvin Jun, CEO of Jun Holdings, involved in serious vehicle accident. Spinal injury reported. Partial paralysis confirmed. Future of company leadership uncertain. The stock market trembled. Phones exploded with calls. Flowers arrived at the Jun mansion by the dozens. Grace appeared on every camera, composed and tearful, playing the role of the devoted fiancée with breathtaking precision. Kelvin watched her performance from his bed. He said nothing. The first 2 weeks, Grace was almost convincing. She brought him soup in the mornings. She sat beside him for short stretches, holding his hand, talking softly. She posted photographs on social media. "Standing by my love through everything." And the comments were flooded with admiration. People called her strong, faithful, a rare kind of woman. Kelvin let her play it out. He noticed the small truths even then. The way she checked her phone constantly while sitting beside him. The way the soup was always barely warm, as if she had reheated something old and didn't bother checking the temperature. The way she never actually looked at him when she spoke, her eyes always slightly past him, calculating something he couldn't see. But he waited. Because his father had told him to wait. Because the real test wasn't in the first week of crisis, it was in the weeks that followed, when the attention faded, when the cameras left, when it was just the two of them and the weight of reality. And that was when Grace Tan began to change. It started slowly. The morning soup stopped coming. Then the visits shortened from an hour to 20 minutes to barely 5. Then came the sighs, long theatrical sighs. Every time a nurse or housekeeper asked her something related to Kelvin's care, she stopped adjusting his pillows. She stopped asking if he was in pain. One afternoon, Kelvin called her name 3 times from the bedroom. She didn't come. He could hear her downstairs, her voice bright and animated, talking to Henrietta Sia, her closest friend, a woman whose wealth was matched only by her cruelty. How long are you supposed to keep doing this? Henrietta's voice drifted upstairs, sharp and amused. Grace's response made Kelvin's chest tighten. I don't know. But I didn't sign up to be a nurse. Kelvin stared at the ceiling. He didn't flinch. He had promised Sandru he wouldn't flinch. But something inside him, something he had been protecting for a long time, quietly began to crack. The day Chimdudo first saw it clearly, she almost dropped the file she was carrying. She had come to the June mansion to deliver quarterly reports, the same routine she had followed for 2 years as Kelvin's personal secretary. She was professional, punctual, the kind of employee who never crossed lines, never overstepped, never made her presence larger than it needed to be. She knocked. She waited. She delivered. She left. But that afternoon, the housekeeper let her in and then disappeared. And Chimdudo walked down the hallway toward the sitting room and heard something that stopped her completely. A low sound. Weak. Barely audible. She followed it. She pushed open the bedroom door and what she saw hit her like a physical blow. Kelvin was slumped sideways in his wheelchair. His head dropped at an uncomfortable angle. His lips cracked and dry. His clothes were soiled. The room had a stale, sharp smell that turned her stomach. A tray of food sat on the far table, cold, untouched, completely out of his reach. He couldn't get to it, and no one had bothered to bring it closer. He looked up when she entered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was something in his eyes that she had never seen in the 2 years she had worked for him. Not embarrassment. Not pride. Just a deep, quiet exhaustion, the kind that comes from being broken down slowly, not all at once. Mr. June. Her voice came out softer than she intended. He turned his face away. Grace's response made Kelvin's chest tighten. I don't know. But I didn't sign up to be a nurse. Kelvin stared at the ceiling. He didn't flinch. He had promised Sandru he wouldn't flinch. But something inside him, something he had been protecting for a long time, quietly began to crack. The day Chimdudo first saw it clearly, she almost dropped the file she was carrying. She had come to the June mansion to deliver quarterly reports, the same routine she had followed for 2 years as Kelvin's personal secretary. She was professional, punctual, the kind of employee who never crossed lines, never overstepped, never made her presence larger than it needed to be. She knocked. She waited. She delivered. She left. But that afternoon, the housekeeper let her in and then disappeared. And Chimdudo walked down the hallway toward the sitting room and heard something that stopped her completely. A low sound. Weak. Barely audible. She followed it. She pushed open the bedroom door and what she saw hit her like a physical blow. Kelvin was slumped sideways in his wheelchair. His head dropped at an uncomfortable angle. His lips cracked and dry. His clothes were soiled. The room had a stale, sharp smell that turned her stomach. A tray of food sat on the far table, cold, untouched, completely out of his reach. He couldn't get to it, and no one had bothered to bring it closer. He looked up when she entered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was something in his eyes that she had never seen in the 2 years she had worked for him. Not embarrassment. Not pride. Just a deep, quiet exhaustion, the kind that comes from being broken down slowly, not all at once. Mr. June. Her voice came out softer than she intended. He turned his face away. Chimdudo set the files on the floor without thinking. She walked to the bathroom, filled a basin with warm water, grabbed a clean towel from the shelf. Her hands were shaking slightly but she didn't stop moving. She came back, pulled a chair close, and began to gently clean his face and hands without a single word of pity, because she understood instinctively that pity was the last thing he needed. What he needed was someone to simply show up. She came back the next day. Not for the reports. There were no reports due. She came because she had barely slept, because every time she closed her eyes she saw that cold tray of food sitting completely out of his reach, and she could not make herself stay away. She brought a flask of pepper soup from the small kitchen in her apartment. Warm, properly seasoned, the kind of meal that felt like someone had actually thought about another person while making it. Kelvin stared at the flask when she pulled it out. You didn't have to do that, he said. His voice was still rough, still quiet. I know, Chimdudo said simply, and she began spooning it for him. He ate, slowly at first, then with the desperate focus of a man who hadn't had a real meal in days. She watched him eat and felt something twist painfully inside her chest. This was one of the most powerful men in South Korea. And he was sitting here in his own home starving. She said nothing about Grace. She didn't need to. The absence of Grace in that room said everything. Grace found out Chimdudo had been coming by, and she didn't like it. Not because she cared about Kelvin, but because she cared about appearances. A black secretary showing up with homemade food looked strange. It looked like a story waiting to be written, and Grace had worked too hard crafting her public image to let some secretary complicate it. She cornered Chimdudo in the hallway one afternoon, all perfume and polished contempt. "You work for the company," Grace said, her voice smooth and pointed. "Not for this house. Know your place." Chimdudo met her eyes. She didn't shrink. She didn't apologize. She simply said, "I was delivering documents, Miss Tan," and walked past her. But the moment she was outside, her hands clenched at her sides. Because she had seen the bruise on Kelvin's arm that afternoon. Fresh, dark purple against his skin. And Grace hadn't even been in the room when Chimdudo arrived. Meaning no one had been with him for hours. That night, Chimdudo sat on the edge of her bed and cried. Not for herself. For him. For the version of Kelvin June the world thought they knew, powerful, untouchable. And for the reality of the man sitting upstairs in his own filth while his fiancée planned dinner parties. She pressed her hands together and began to pray. She didn't pray for a promotion. She didn't pray for anything for herself. She prayed for his healing. She prayed that whatever was breaking inside him would be restored. She prayed with the kind of sincerity that doesn't know how to be anything else, the kind that fills a quiet room and settles over everything like warmth. She didn't know anyone was listening. Kelvin heard every word. His bedroom door had been left slightly open. He had been awake, staring at the ceiling the way he did most nights now, when her voice reached him from down the hall, low and steady and completely unguarded, the way people only speak when they think no one can hear them. He didn't move. He barely breathed. He listened to her pray for him with a fullness that made something in his chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with physical pain. Because in 34 years, through boardrooms and contracts and relationships and power, no one had ever simply prayed for him. Not like that. Not without wanting something back. He turned his head toward the door. In the dim light he could see her shadow on the wall from the hallway. Small still, completely absorbed in something invisible. He thought about Grace's words from 2 weeks ago. "I didn't sign up to be a nurse." He thought about the cold soup, the untouched tray, the hours he spent alone without a single person checking whether he was still breathing. Then he thought about the flask of pepper soup. Warm, properly seasoned, made in a small apartment by a woman who owed him absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, Grace's patience had fully collapsed. She had stopped pretending even when the housekeepers were watching. She moved through the mansion like Kelvin was already gone. Already erased from the story of her life. She rearranged furniture in the living room without asking. She began redirecting his personal mail. She spent long afternoons at a private residence across the city that she told no one about. But Sandrew knew. Sandrew had known for weeks. He had photographs, timestamps, recorded phone calls. Brian Lee was a property developer, younger than Kelvin, flashier, far less intelligent, and completely taken in by Grace the way men often were. They had been meeting 3 times a week. Grace had already begun asking Brian quiet questions about financial structures, about asset transfers, about what a woman needed to protect herself in the event of a partner's incapacitation. She was not grieving a sick man. She was planning an exit. Sandrew placed the first folder of evidence on his desk and picked up his phone. He called Kelvin. "Are you ready to hear it?" he asked. Kelvin was quiet for a moment. Then, "Tell me everything." Sandrew talked for 40 minutes. Kelvin didn't interrupt once. When Sandrew finally stopped, the silence on the other end was the particular kind that comes before a decision has been made. Not empty but full. Dense with something cold and final settling into place. "Set the date," Kelvin said quietly. "Engagement dinner. 3 weeks. And Chimdudo?" Another silence. "Make sure she's there," Kelvin said. Mrs. Colton Sarah had worked for the June household for 11 years. She had seen things. Kept her mouth closed about most of them. She was the kind of woman who noticed everything and said very little, which was precisely why Kelvin's mother trusted her completely. She had been watching Chimdudo for weeks. One evening she found Chimdudo in the kitchen, washing the bowl she had used to feed Kelvin, her face tilted slightly downward, her expression carrying something she was clearly trying not to carry. Mrs. Colton Sarah dried her hands on a cloth and stood beside her. "You care about him," she said. Not a question. Chimdudo didn't answer immediately. "He's my employer." "That's not what I asked." Chimdudo turned off the tap, stood still for a moment. It doesn't matter what I feel, Mrs. Colton. He's engaged. He's my boss. I'm just doing what any decent person would do. Mrs. Colton Sarah looked at her for a long moment. Be careful, child. Sometimes caring deeply for broken people can break you too. Chimdudo nodded slowly, but her eyes said something different. They said it was already too late to be careful. The night Grace went too far started like any other evening at the June mansion. Music drifted up from the ground floor. Voices. Laughter. The particular sound of expensive people enjoying themselves without a single worry in the world. Grace had invited 8 guests for dinner, Henrietta Sia among them, and the table was set with imported candles and fresh flowers and every beautiful, hollow thing that Grace loved to surround herself with. Kelvin was upstairs. He had been upstairs since afternoon. No food. No water. His call button had been quietly moved to the other side of the room. Whether by accident or intention, it didn't matter. The result was the same. He couldn't reach it. By the time the first dinner course was being served downstairs, Kelvin's hands were shaking. Not from fear. From hunger. From hours of sitting in the same position with nothing. His body, even in the performance of weakness, had become genuinely depleted. The lines between the act and the reality had been blurring for weeks, and tonight they collapsed entirely. He tried to call out. His voice barely carried past the doorway. Chimdudo had not planned to come that evening. She had finished work early, gone home eaten, and was sitting quietly in her apartment when something pulled at her. She couldn't explain it then and she couldn't explain it later. It wasn't logic. It was the particular unease of someone whose instincts have been trained by weeks of witnessing things that should not be witnessed. She got up. She picked up her bag. She took a taxi to the June mansion. The housekeeper let her in through the side entrance, surprised to see her at that hour. Music and laughter floated through the corridor from the dining room. No one paid her attention. She moved through the hallway and up the stairs and pushed open Kelvin's bedroom door. What she found destroyed something inside her. He was half-slumped in his wheelchair, his face pale, his lips dry and cracked, trembling from the core outward. The room was dim, cold. The call button was across the room, completely unreachable. The dinner downstairs had been running for over an hour. Kelvin. His name left her mouth before she could stop it. Not Mr. June. Not Sir. Just his name, raw and immediate, the way you say someone's name when you are genuinely frightened for them. His eyes opened slowly. Chimdi, he whispered. She was already moving. Pulling the blanket from the bed, wrapping it around his shoulders, grabbing the small emergency kit she had started keeping in her bag weeks ago. She had warm tea in a flask. She always carried it now. She pressed it into his hands, steadied his grip, watched him drink. Then she broke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and the tears came silently, the kind that carried genuine grief rather than performance. Because downstairs a party was happening. Music was playing. And up here this man, her boss, the most powerful person she had ever worked for, had been sitting alone and starving and shaking while his fiancée laughed with her friends over imported wine. Don't cry, Kelvin said softly. She shook her head. She couldn't stop immediately. Chimdi. His voice was quiet but present. More present than it had been in weeks. Look at me. She looked at him. His eyes were steady, clear, and in them was something she had not expected. Not helplessness. Not despair. Something more like resolve. Something that looked almost like a man who had finally found exactly what he came looking for, even though the finding had cost him everything. Thank you, he said. For all of it. She wiped her face quickly. You don't have to thank me. I know I don't have to. His jaw tightened slightly. That's why I'm saying it. 3 weeks later, the engagement dinner was the most talked about event in Seoul's social calendar. The venue was the Grand Jura Hall. A ballroom of marble and gold light, 500 guests, cameras from 3 major media outlets stationed at the entrance. Everyone who mattered in South Korean society had been invited. And at the center of it all, Grace Tan arrived in a gown that cost more than most people earned in a year, her hand resting on the handle of Kelvin's wheelchair, her face composed into the perfect portrait of devoted love. She had prepared a speech. She delivered it beautifully. Kelvin has shown me what real strength looks like, she said, her voice catching just enough to sound sincere. Standing beside him through this has only deepened what I feel. I choose him. Every day. Without condition. The room erupted in applause. Henrietta Sia clapped from the third table, her expression carefully arranged into admiration. Grace smiled. Gracious. Humble. Radiant. Then the applause began to fade. And in the silence that followed, something shifted. A sound, quiet at first. The particular sound of weight settling onto a floor. One step, then another, then another. Heads turned. Whispers broke out across the room like a current moving through water. Kelvin June was standing. He rose from the wheelchair slowly, deliberately, with the controlled steadiness of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. He straightened to his full height. He adjusted the collar of his suit. He looked across the ballroom with the eyes of a CEO, calm, cold, and completely in command. The room went absolutely silent. Grace's smile collapsed. The color drained from her face so completely that even her foundation couldn't hide it. Her hand fell from the wheelchair handle. Her carefully rehearsed composure, the thing she had been performing for months, shattered in real time in front of 500 witnesses. "Kelvin," she started. "Grace." His voice carried across the entire room without effort. Not raised. Not angry. Just final. "You failed the only test that mattered." Sandrew was already moving. He stepped forward from the edge of the room, tablet in hand, and the screens mounted on the ballroom walls, meant for the evening's presentation slides, flickered to life with something entirely different. Photographs. Timestamps. Security footage. Financial records. Brian Lee's face appeared on screen. Then Grace's. Together, unmistakably, in locations that required no explanation. Then came the audio recording. Grace's voice filled the room, crisp and undeniable. "I didn't sign up to be a nurse." Then another recording, darker, from a different afternoon. "Even a dog is more useful than you." Then the financial documents, account transfers, withdrawal requests, a draft legal letter prepared by Grace's private attorney outlining asset claims in the event of a partner's permanent incapacitation. She had not been planning a life with Kelvin. She had been planning what to take when he was gone. The silence in the ballroom was the kind that precedes something irreversible. Grace looked around the room, at the screens, at the guests, at Henrietta, who had already shifted her chair slightly backward, creating visible distance from Grace with the quiet efficiency of someone protecting their own reputation. This isn't," Grace's voice broke. "You don't understand. Sit down, Grace," Kelvin said quietly. She sat, not because she wanted to, but because her legs stopped holding her. The aftermath moved quickly, the way these things always do when truth has been waiting long enough. The June family released a formal statement ending the engagement by midnight. Grace's family, blindsided and humiliated, went silent. Brian Lee, who had watched the entire livestream from his apartment across the city, switched his phone off and was not heard from for weeks. Henrietta Sia gave a brief interview 2 days later in which she carefully described Grace as an acquaintance she had not been close to. The media did what the media does. Within 72 hours, Grace Tan's name was attached to every version of the story that made her look worst. She tried once to release a statement through a publicist. It made things worse. She disappeared from public life quietly, the way people do when there is nothing left to defend. She had walked into the June mansion as a future empress. She left it with nothing. Chimdudo heard about the engagement dinner the same way most people did. Through her phone, through notifications, through the sudden explosion of messages in every group she was part of. She sat in her small apartment and read the headlines and felt something complicated move through her. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Something quieter and sadder than either of those things. She had never wanted it to end this way. She had just wanted him to be okay. Kelvin called her 2 days later. Not through an assistant. Not through a formal email. He called her directly on her personal number at 7 in the evening. "I'd like to see you," he said. "If that's all right." She paused. "Is everything okay?" "Yes." A brief silence. There are things I want to say to you. In person." He met her in the garden of the June estate, away from the mansion's formal rooms, away from the staff and the cameras and the weight of everything the house represented. It was evening. The light was low and gold and the garden smelled like late summer. He was standing when she arrived. She had not yet gotten used to seeing him standing. "You prayed for me," he said without preamble. Chimdudo went still. "I heard you. One night down the hall." He looked at her steadily. "You weren't praying for anything for yourself. You were just praying for me to be okay." She didn't answer immediately. Then quietly, "I meant every word." "I know you did." He exhaled. "That's the thing, Chimdi. In 34 years I have had people around me who wanted my money, my name, my access, my attention. And I got very good at pretending that was enough." He paused. "And then there was you. Showing up with pepper soup in a flask because you couldn't sleep." Her eyes filled. "You didn't see a CEO," he continued. You just saw a person who needed help. And you helped him. He stepped closer. I don't know how to repay that. I'm not sure it can be repaid. But I would like very much to try. The tears escaped before she could stop them. She laughed softly through them, embarrassed, pressing her fingers to the corners of her eyes. You're going to make me cry in this garden, she said. You cried for me for weeks, he said. I think it's fair. It didn't happen overnight. Real things rarely do. Kelvin courted her slowly, carefully. The way a man moves when he understands the weight of what he almost lost. He learned what made her laugh, genuinely laugh, not politely laugh. He learned that she took her tea without sugar and her stories without embellishment and her apologies without repetition. He learned that she was stronger than she looked and softer than she allowed most people to see. And Chimduto learned that beneath the empire and the boardrooms and the surname that moved markets, Kelvin June was a man who had been quietly lonely for a very long time, who had almost married the wrong person because he hadn't trusted himself to hope for the right one. Madame June, who had once looked at Chimduto with careful, measuring eyes, sat across from her one afternoon over tea and said simply, You held my son together when I didn't know he was falling apart. There is no title I can give you that is worth more than that. Chimduto held the teacup in both hands and nodded. She didn't need a title. She never had. Months later, on a quiet evening in the same garden where everything had shifted, Kelvin took her hand. He didn't make a speech. He didn't have a production planned. He simply held her hand in both of his and looked at her the way a person looks at something they almost didn't get to keep. You loved me when I looked worthless, he said. And I will spend my life proving your kindness was never wasted. Chimduto looked at him. This man who had tested the world's love for him and found it hollow, and then found something real in the most unexpected place, and felt something in her chest settle into a peace she hadn't known she was searching for. She squeezed his hand. Don't waste it then, she said softly. And he didn't.
Moral lesson. Sometimes, people only love us because of what we can give to them, not because of who we truly are. The moment the money, power, beauty, or usefulness disappears, their real character begins to show. In today's world, many people pretend to care, but difficult moments reveal true intentions. A person who genuinely loves you will stand beside you even when you are weak, struggling, or unable to offer anything in return. This story also teaches us never to look down on kindness. The people who quietly help us during our lowest moments are often the ones with the purest hearts. As humans, we should learn to treat people with compassion, patience, and dignity, because life can change at any moment. Today you may be strong, successful, and admired, but tomorrow you may need help from the very people you once ignored. True love is not proven during comfort, but during suffering. And that brings us to the end of today's story. What do you think about this story, and what lesson did you personally learn from it? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section because I'll definitely be reading your comments. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our emotional Afro-Korean stories. Also, check out other interesting stories already available on this channel. There are so many beautiful and emotional stories here that will keep you engaged and entertained. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.